The flashlight was dead. She hadn't dropped it. She hadn't turned it off. It simply stopped, mid-sweep, as she pointed it toward the tree line, toward whatever had just moved in the dark. And in the fraction of a second before the darkness swallowed everything, she saw it. A shape. Standing still between two pines, not moving toward her, not moving away, just standing there, the way something stands when it has been watching for a long time and has decided it no longer needs to hide. That was only the beginning of the third story you're about to hear. What follows are 5 accounts from people who went into the wilderness expecting nothing unusual. They came back changed. Some can explain what happened, some cannot. What connects them is this. At some point during each trip, they realized they were not alone and that whoever was out there with them had known exactly where to find them. These are their stories. Story 1. The campsite that wasn't empty. The reservation had been made weeks in advance. Rory Callahan had done everything right. Printed the permit, mapped the trail, packed enough food for 4 nights in the Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois. He was 34, had been camping since he was a kid, and had stopped finding it exciting and started finding it necessary. The way some people needed the ocean, he needed trees and dirt and quiet. He got to the trailhead around noon on a Thursday and set off with his pack. It was a 2-mile hike to the designated campsite, a flat clearing near a creek that fed into a larger lake. He'd been there twice before. Good site, sheltered from wind on the north side by a ridge, open enough on the south that you could see stars. The trail was empty, mid-October. Most people had stopped coming for the season. That was exactly how he liked it. He heard the creek before he saw the clearing, which was normal. But when he stepped through the last stretch of brush and into the site, he stopped walking. Someone was already there. Not a person. There was nobody visible, but a tent was set up near the fire ring, and a chair sat open beside it, and a lantern hung from the rope line between 2 trees like it had been there long enough to settle in. He looked around, checked both sides of the clearing, walked the perimeter of the site slowly. Nobody. He pulled out the permit, compared it to the numbered post at the edge of the clearing. This was Site 14, and his reservation was for Site 14, and there were no other sites within half a mile. He called out a hello, waited, called again, louder. The creek answered him. He gave it a full 10 minutes, walked the tree line looking for a second trail, a different path in. There wasn't one. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had put the tent up and then left to go fishing at the lake. Maybe they had the wrong site number. Maybe they'd be back before dark and would realize the mistake and move. He set his pack down at the far end of the clearing, away from the other tent, and started making his own camp. Nobody came back. By dusk, he'd eaten, started a small fire, and was beginning to relax. The other tent was just a tent, probably a confused hiker who'd either moved on or would return sheepishly in the morning with an apology and help striking their camp. The lantern in the rope line wasn't lit. Nothing felt threatening. He stayed up until about 9, then banked the fire and turned in. He woke at 2 a.m. with no alarm and no sound, just woke, the way he sometimes did in unfamiliar places, and lay still for a moment, orienting himself. The tent was dark. The forest was quiet. He reached for his phone to check the time, and as its screen lit briefly, he noticed something through the mesh panel of the inner tent. The lantern was on. He sat up, pressed his face to the mesh. The lantern hung in the rope line between the 2 trees was lit, a warm amber glow, low and steady. It had not been lit when he went to sleep. He was sure of that. He pulled on his boots without lacing them and unzipped the tent. Cold air rushed in. He stepped out into the clearing and stood there. The fire ring was dark, just orange coals. The stars were out. The other tent sat maybe 40 feet away, canvas sides faintly bright from the lantern overhead. "Hello?" he said, not loudly, just to the dark. Nothing. He crossed to the other tent, stood outside it. Is someone in there? He could see no movement through the fabric. He reached out to touch the door zipper, then stopped himself. Maybe someone is sleeping. Maybe they woke up in the night and lit the lantern for comfort. He went back to his tent, lay there, stared at the glowing panel of mesh for a long time. At some point, he slept. Morning. The lantern was off. The other tent was empty. He unzipped it fully in daylight and looked inside. A sleeping bag, a pillow, a dry bag in the corner. The sleeping bag looked undisturbed, like it had never been unrolled. He sat with his coffee and tried to reconstruct a logical explanation. Someone had set up camp and then left before he arrived. But the lantern coming on in the night meant someone had been there, was there, had walked into the clearing while he slept and lit the lantern and then walked back out. He packed and left a day early. He told himself he was being irrational. 6 weeks later, he submitted a trip report to the trail's online forum, and one of the comments came back from a regular hiker who knew that stretch of forest. They told him that Site 14 had been the location of an unresolved case 2 years ago, a man who had disappeared from that exact campsite. His gear had been found there, tent set up, chair by the fire ring, lantern on the rope line. He'd never been located. Rory doesn't know what walked into that clearing in the night. He doesn't have a clean explanation, but he keeps thinking about something he noticed in the morning that he'd almost dismissed. The dry bag in the other tent in the corner was empty. Whatever it had been used to carry was gone. He never touched it. He assumed it was someone's food or gear. He doesn't know how long that tent had actually been there.
Portia Wern was 30 years old and had been planning the solo backpacking trip for the most of the year. 7 days in the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. No trails for the last 3 days. Off the map, essentially. Or at least off the maintained map. She had her coordinates, her satellite communicator, and enough experience to know that the isolation wasn't a risk, it was the point. She was 4 days in when she first saw the man. It was late afternoon, the light going golden and horizontal through the pines. She'd made camp at the edge of a wide alpine meadow, tent pitched near the tree line for wind cover, small cook stove growing. She was heating water for a dehydrated meal and looking out across the meadow, and she saw him on the far side, maybe 300 yards. A human shape, standing still at the edge of the trees, dark jacket. She could see the shape of a pack on his back. She raised a hand and waved. He didn't wave back. He didn't move. She looked away to attend to the stove, and when she looked up again, he was gone. She didn't think much of it. Wilderness crossings happened. People moved through without making contact. The Bob Marshall wasn't empty even when it felt empty. She ate. She set up her bear hang. She went to sleep. She saw him again the next morning. She'd awoken early and was outside the tent with her coffee, sitting on a flat rock, watching the meadow go from gray to pale gold as the sun came up behind the ridge. He was at the tree line of the north side of the meadow this time. Same distance, same stillness. She watched him for a solid minute without moving. He did not move. "Hey!" she called across the meadow, not yelling, but loud enough. He turned and walked into the trees. That bothered her more than seeing him. The walk wasn't hurried. It was slow and deliberate, like he'd heard her and decided that was his cue to leave, like he'd been waiting until she acknowledged him. She spent the day moving north, covering ground quickly. Around midday, she hit a section of deadfall that slowed her considerably, a blowdown of old timber crossing the drainage she was following. While she picked her way through it, she found boot prints in a soft patch of mud on the other side. Fresh ones, given the moisture. She put her own boot beside them,
a larger shoe, deeper print, heavier person. The prints headed north, the same direction she was going. She stopped early that day, set up camp on a rocky knoll with clear sightlines in all directions. Before dark, she got out the satellite communicator and sent a check-in message to her contact back home, the standard all good she'd promised to send each evening. She added 4 words she hadn't planned to include. Saw someone heading north. She built no fire that night, ate cold food, sat inside the tent with her headlamp off for an hour, listening. The night was normal. Wind, owls, the distant sound of water. In the morning, she found the footprints again on the south side of her rocky knoll. They came from the tree line to the east, crossed within 30 feet of her tent in the night, and continued west, off the knoll and into the drainage below. He had walked past her tent in the night. She pulled out her map. The nearest trailhead was 18 miles south. The nearest maintained trail was 11 miles east. She was not in a place where casual hikers wandered. Anyone here had made a specific choice to be here, which meant he knew where he was going. And at least twice, he had been going somewhere close to where she was. She activated the satellite communicator and sent a longer message to her contact. Then she broke camp and moved fast. She covered 12 miles that day, pushing south toward the main trail corridor. She didn't see him again. By afternoon of the following day, she was back on maintained trail, and the day after that, she hit the trailhead. She didn't see him at the trailhead. She didn't see anyone. She thought maybe it was over, thought maybe she'd spooked herself over a coincidence, another wilderness traveler moving through the same terrain. Then her contact forwarded something she'd sent on night 5 from the satellite communicator. The message had logged the coordinates from which it was sent, as all satellite messages did, and someone at the Forest Service office, when her contact called to report what she'd described, had looked up those coordinates. There had been a report filed 6 months earlier. A separate backpacker had sent a distress signal within 2 miles of those same coordinates. She'd described a man following her. She made it out. They never identified who she saw. Portia got home and spent a week not sleeping well. She'd go back to the Bob Marshall. She'd already decided. But she thinks about the footprints now, the ones that crossed 30 feet from her tent in the dark. She thinks about the slow, deliberate way he walked into the trees when she called out to him. Not startled, not embarrassed, like someone who had been there before and already knew the way back in.
The summer that Dex Morales turned 26 was the summer he decided to drive from Austin to the Washita National Forest in Arkansas with his girlfriend, Lena, and no particular plan. They had a tent, a cooler, and a long weekend. They took a Forest Service road off the highway and drove until the pavement ended, then kept driving until they found a flat spot near a creek and decided that was enough. No reservation, no cell service, no other vehicles on the road when they turned onto it. They set up camp in the early evening. The creek was clear and cold and ran shallow over a bed of flat gray stones. They cooked over the camp stove, drank cheap beer, and sat outside until well after dark, which was Lena's favorite part. The way the dark out there didn't feel like city dark, didn't have a glow behind it, just went all the way down. They went to bed around midnight. Dex woke at what he guessed was maybe 2 a.m. He lay there half awake, not sure what had pulled him up, and then he heard it, a sound he couldn't immediately categorize. Not an animal, not the wind, something rhythmic and low, almost like footsteps, but slower, deliberate. He sat up, reached for his flashlight, put his hand on Lena's shoulder, and she stirred, and he put a finger to her lips, which she knew she'd hate, and mouthed, "Listen." She listened. Her eyes went fully open. The sound stopped. He waited 60 seconds, turned the flashlight on, and unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Dark. The creek running. Nothing else. He swept the light around the clearing, hit every corner of the tree line, looked down both sides of the creek bank.
Nothing. He held the light still and listened for another full minute. Then he clicked it off, waited for his eyes to readjust, and stood in the dark. That was when he saw it. A light in the trees, across the creek, maybe 40 or 50 yards north. Just a small, steady light. Not a flashlight beam, not a lantern glow, more like the light of a phone screen, pale and cool. It was stationary for the time it took him to register it, and then it moved. Not quickly. It moved like something carried by someone walking, a gentle, swaying motion between the trunks. He watched it until it was out of sight in the trees. He went back inside and told Lena, who wanted to leave immediately and was right to want to. He talked her into staying, which he regrets. He told her it was probably a fellow camper who'd wandered up the road, probably a harmless person who hadn't even known they were camped there. He believed that when he said it. He kept believing it until morning. In the morning, he went across the creek. He found the flat, soft mud on the far bank where someone had stood. The impressions were clear. 2 boots, facing the creek, facing them. He measured the distance back to the tent with his eyes. Whoever stood there had a clear view of the tent door and at least 15 feet in each direction. And near the tree line, tied to a low branch at eye level, was a strip of orange surveyor's tape, fresh, the kind you buy at any hardware store. It had been tied there recently. The knot was tight and the tape was dry, which meant it hadn't been through last night's dew. He'd been looking at the tent, and he'd marked the spot. They left before eating breakfast. Dex doesn't understand the surveyor's tape. He's tried to interpret it as something innocent, a hiker marking a trail, a hunter marking a stand. But the stand was directly across the creek from their tent, with a clear line of sight to the door on a Forest Service road they'd driven down randomly, and they hadn't seen another vehicle the entire time they were there. Lena broke up with him the following month. She said it was other things, and it probably was, but sometimes he wonders whether that night and his choice to stay was part of it. The flashlight died mid-sweep when he pointed it towards the trees. Just stopped, the way she'd described at the start, the way all electronics seem to fail when you most need them not to. He bought new batteries. He didn't go back.
The cabin rental was supposed to be a birthday treat. Wynn Tabor's husband had booked it, 3 nights in a private cabin in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina, accessible by a gravel road that branched off the main highway and wound 2 miles up into the hills. Private dock on a small reservoir. No neighbors within earshot. It was, her husband Cal said, exactly what she'd asked for. She had asked for something quiet. They arrived in the late afternoon of a Friday, used the lockbox code, and let themselves in. The cabin was clean and well-furnished, a basic kitchen, a wood-burning fireplace, 2 bedrooms, a porch that looked out over the water. It smelled like lemon cleaning product and old pine and somebody else's candles, the usual smell of a rental. They cooked dinner, built a fire, went to bed early, the way you do on the first night of a trip when the drive has been long. In the morning, Wynn woke before Cal and went to make coffee. While she waited for the pot, she looked out the kitchen window at the reservoir, flat and gray in the early light, a great blue heron standing at the far edge. She was tired and content and not paying close attention to anything, which is probably why it took her a moment to notice the cabinet above the refrigerator was open. She hadn't opened it. She hadn't looked in it the night before. It was too high to reach without a step stool, and she wasn't sure she could reach it now. She pulled a chair over and looked inside. A digital camera. Older model, compact, with a wrist strap. Not a rental amenity. Not something a host would leave out. She turned it over. No name on it, no identifying markings. She pressed the power button and the screen lit up with a low battery warning and showed her the last image. She stood on the chair and looked at it for a long time.
It was a photograph taken through a window. Not a great photo, blurry, taken at night through glass that had caught some reflection. But it was clearly this cabin. Clearly this cabin. The stone fireplace was visible in the background, and in the foreground, slightly out of focus, two sleeping shapes on what she recognized as the couch, which had been set up, according to the guest book, as a bed. The photograph was of the previous guests, asleep, taken from outside the window. She sat down on the chair. She thought about the angle of the window, the darkness outside it, the distance from the porch. Someone had stood on the porch of this rental cabin in the night and photographed the sleeping guests through the glass, and then had somehow left the camera inside. She woke Cal. He looked at the photograph. He looked at her. They called the rental host. The host was confused, then apologetic, then defensive, said they had no idea, said they'd never had a complaint like this, said they cleaned thoroughly between guests, said the last guests had been a couple from Charlotte who'd left a positive review. They did not stay the second and third nights. When she got home, Wynne wrote a private message to the couple from Charlotte. She found them through a Hicking forum connected to the cabin's listing, cross-referenced with other reviews. She sent a vague note. She'd stayed at the same cabin and found something left behind. Did they want her to mail it? The woman from Charlotte replied the following week. She said they'd had a wonderful trip. She said they both slept heavily on the last night there and had woken up feeling foggy and overtired, which they'd chalked up to the wood smoke or too much wine. She said her husband had lost his camera on that trip and they'd been meaning to contact the host but hadn't gotten around to it. She asked Wynne to describe the camera. Wynne described it. There was a long pause before the next message came back. That wasn't her husband's camera. Their camera was a different brand. Whoever had taken the photograph and left the camera inside the locked cabin had taken it from somewhere else, or had bought it and left it there on purpose. For the next person who went looking in the cabinet above the refrigerator.
This is the one I keep coming back to. Not because it's the most violent, it isn't. Not because the ending is ambiguous, it isn't. It's the one that stays because of the simplest detail. The one revealed at the very end. The one that means everything you've just heard has to be heard again from the beginning. Carla Fitch was 41 years old and had been driving the same route every September for the past 11 years. Her mother's property in northeastern Oregon sat at the end of a long gravel road off Route 395, bordered on three sides by Umatilla National Forest. No neighbors for 7 miles. No cell service until you got back to the highway. Her mother had passed away 4 years ago and left Carla the land, and Carla came every September to check the property, do any repairs, and spend 5 or 6 nights alone in the small house with the wood stove and the stack of paperbacks she never got through the rest of the year. It was her week, her 1 week of pure quiet every year. She arrived on Sunday evening. The gate at the end of the gravel road was padlocked the way she'd left it the previous September, which was always the first thing she checked. She unlocked it, drove through, locked it behind her. The house was musty and cold, but intact. She aired it out, made a fire, heated soup. She slept well the first 2 nights. On Tuesday, she drove into town, 40 minutes on the highway, for groceries and fuel, and came back in the early afternoon. As she turned off the highway onto the gravel road, she noticed tire tracks in the soft shoulder, recent ones. They came from the highway and turned onto the road, and then about 100 feet in, turned round and went back. She walked the turnaround point. Whoever it was had stopped here, the road still visible from the highway, and reversed. She looked at the tread. A wide tire, a truck or SUV. Nothing particular about it. She told herself it was a hiker who'd tried a wrong road. That happened. She locked the gate with extra care when she got home. Wednesday was quiet. She read on the porch all morning. In the afternoon, she walked the property line, which she did once a year to check the fence posts and the corners.
On the north side of the property, where the fence met the national forest boundary, she found a section of fence that had been compressed. Not broken, not cut, just pressed down at a point where the wire was old and loose. Something large had stepped over it, or someone had. The compression was recent. The grass was still bent. She walked back to the house. She checked all the doors and windows. She spent the rest of the afternoon convincing herself it was a deer or an elk, which weren't uncommon. The fence compression looked like what you'd see when an elk crosses. She had seen that before. She slept less well Wednesday night. Thursday, she went through the house more carefully than usual, looking at everything, checking the storage rooms in the back, the crawlspace door, the outbuilding where her mother had kept tools. Nothing disturbed, nothing missing. She walked to the outbuilding around noon. Inside it were her mother's tools, stacked firewood, an old ATV that hadn't run in 3 years. And on the workbench, which she had cleared and organized the previous September and left bare, there was a coffee mug. A clean coffee mug. A ceramic mug, dark blue with no markings. It had never been there before. She knew the workbench. She had a clear memory of sweeping it down and stacking the hand tools in the metal cabinet along the wall. She picked up the mug. It was clean, bone dry inside. She turned it over. No markings on the bottom either. Just a mug that someone had left on a workbench in a locked outbuilding on a private road in northeastern Oregon. She locked the outbuilding and went inside the house and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She was not a person who panicked. She was methodical. She thought it through. The outbuilding had a padlock. She had the key. Her sister had a copy. A neighbor 7 miles down had a spare she'd given him years ago for emergencies, and she still needed to get that back. She drove 7 miles and knocked on his door. He was a retired rancher in his 70s named Gil, and he'd watched the property for Carla's mother for 2 decades. She'd always trusted him completely. He answered the door, and she asked him about the key, and he said, of course. Went inside, came back with it, said he hadn't needed it since Carla's mother passed, said he'd never used it while Carla was up here, didn't want to intrude. She drove back, sat in the car in front of the house, thought about the tire tracks at the start of the road, the fence compression on the north boundary, the mug. Then she thought about who else might know that road. She'd kept the property low-key, hadn't posted about it, but there were people who'd been out here over the years. Her mother's friends, people from the church, a man her mother had hired once to do work on the septic system. She couldn't inventory every person who ever knew the address. She called her sister that evening from the highway where she had service, told her everything. Her sister told her to come home. She said she'd think about it. She went back that night because she didn't want to be afraid of her own property. She locked every door. She left a light on in the front room. She slept on the couch with a hand near the fireplace poker. In the morning, she decided to leave a day early. Not because anything else had happened, because she couldn't stop thinking clearly out there, and she needed to think clearly. She drove out, stopped at the gate, unlocked it, drove through, got out to lock it behind her, and she saw the notebook. It was on the ground near the gate post, a small spiral notebook, the cheap kind. She picked it up and opened it, mostly blank, but the first page had writing, a list of dates, 9 dates, 1 per line, spanning the last 11 years. She looked at the most recent one, September of last year. She looked at all 9. They were the dates she had come to the property. Every September, every visit, written down. Not her handwriting. She had never seen this notebook before. She stood at the gate with the notebook in her hand and looked back up the gravel road at her mother's house and understood something that changed everything she experienced all week and everything she accepted about the previous 11 years of coming here alone. Someone had been tracking her visits, not trying to steal from her, not trespassing by accident. They were watching the pattern, learning the schedule, learning when she would be there, and learning when she would not be. She drove to the sheriff's office in town with the notebook in a Ziploc bag. The deputy who took her statement asked if she had any idea how long this had been going on. She pointed to the first date on the list. 11 years. He'd been coming before she arrived and leaving before she got there. She sold the property the following spring. She doesn't know if they ever found him. But what she told me, the part that I can't stop turning over, is this. The first date on that list, the very first one, was not from 11 years ago. It was from 19 years ago. 6 years before Carla had ever set foot on that property, when her mother was still alive and coming alone.